Welcome to another episode of the Love Not Fear podcast in the context of transformational cultures. Today, my guest is wonderful Jon Barnes, who is a coach facilitator and the co-founder of Pala. And our topic today is the unschooling mindset, I am my relationships. Hello, Jon. It's so great to have you here.
Thanks. This is going to be really fun. Really looking forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, me too. Me too. And the title is already very intriguing, I think. Some people are like, yeah, wow, what are you going to talk about? Well, we'll get into that in a minute. But to just give our audience a little bit of a context of who you are, would you maybe tell us a little bit more about your story?
Yeah, so hello, everyone. I'm really excited about this conversation. A little bit about me. So I'm the co-founder of Pala. We essentially help organizations move towards cultures that are highly empowering. So high degrees of autonomy, very much inspired by self-management, although not dogmatically so. So we help a lot of teams and organizations that are quite hierarchical to really empower their teams to be able to make all sorts of decisions. I've been doing this for over 10 years, probably started off as a facilitator really, and then a coach, and then consulting's kind of come into it. But most of my inspiration, I would say, in the last 5 years or so has come from outside of the field and really has come from the fields of education, psychology, philosophy. So hopefully, I've got my own little blend to share today that's all about how humans are weird and wonderful and succeed and fail all the time.
Amazing. Well, it's so great to have you here. And I have one more question. How would you describe your mission in life? It's a very casual question and it's
Wow.
a good icebreaker.
Yeah, wow. I need a glass of wine for that one. This sounds super earnest, but I do think it. I love seeing someone's mind change. And I don't mean changing opinions. I don't mean I believed A and now I believe B, not at all. I love seeing people just grow fundamentally. And to me, growth is probably something about an increase in autonomy. So an increase in my agency over my own self. That's my behavior. It's some agency over my beliefs, over how I navigate relationships, how I navigate my own emotions, et cetera, et cetera. To me, that's like an incredibly empowering thing to do. And when I see even small little breakthroughs in the teams I work with or bigger ones in the CEOs I work with, perhaps, it just like totally fills my cup. Yeah, it's why I'm so passionate about education and all sorts of other bits as well.
Yeah, I feel that. And I mean, like the first time we met, which is very recently, I could already, I could really feel that out of the conversations and the topics we have discussed. And I would like to go a little bit more into these beliefs actually, because there's also one thing you said in that conversation we had, which struck me, right? You challenged me a little bit on the topic of relationships. Like I have relationships versus I am my relationships. And let's just like let that sink in for a moment, right? Like I have relationships versus I am my relationships. I was like, whoa, like mind blow. So thinking about that and just reflecting a little bit on it, it's really like it gives you a different kind of perspective of how to relate with each other, but also how to grow and how to also, get people together within organizations and communities, right?
Mhm.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that and where that is coming from?
So that specific kind of heuristic going from my relationships to I have my relationships comes from Robert Kegan's work. And essentially what it says is that humans grow according to stages. And we know this, and some of them are very obvious, like a baby. This is so mad, but a baby doesn't feel separate from their mother. They feel like they are their mother, right? And that's why when the mother leaves the room, it's very scary for the baby. It's called object permanence. So they don't have object permanence. It's why peekaboo is like, oh my God, they've gone. They've actually gone. Oh, they're back. Oh, they've gone again, right? So that's how babies understand the world. And then they grow, and then suddenly they know that you're there even when you're not in the room. They know that you're there. And then they really get into role play. And we misunderstand role play when little kids, typically like 2 to 4, when they're playing mummy and daddy, they're not just copying mummy and daddies. They are, in a way, they're actually creating the concept. They're creating the idea of what a mummy and daddy is to them. So it's a form of therapy. They're creating the world. I had this so my son is not biologically my son, so I met him when he was 6. And one of the first things he wanted to do was play shop. And so he was the shopkeeper. But then he asked me and my now wife, his mum, to be married. he was simulating what would it be like if they got married. And then he asked me to be his dad and her to be the shopkeeper. And he's simulating what would it be like if he was my dad, right? So we know that we grow through these stages. The next stage is very hand. It's why kids play Lego and climb trees when they're 7 to 8. And it's only around age 11 to 13 that kids are really into abstracting like maths and English. In fact, if you don't bother teaching a kid English, or like reading, but
Mhm.
you surround them by it. Around 11, they'll just learn to read very, very quickly on their own. They won't need any tuition. And I've seen this happen dozens of times now. But we've always assumed that that's the end. Right after that, you're kind of a teenager or an adult, and it turns out you're not. There's other stages we can grow through, but the one we mostly get stuck at is what Keegan called the socialized mind. And this is a moment where, just like the baby thinks they are their mother, we often think we are our relationships. It's why we're so influenced by our peers. It's why we're so influenced by comparisons to each other. It's why social media is so powerful. I call it socialized media because really I think it recreates that very mindset that, I don't have a big following on Instagram, so I don't feel so good about myself, or what my dad thinks of me is really important, or my colleagues or my bosses. So hierarchies are particularly powerful in that moment. That is just a stage of development that we can grow out of. And when we grow out of it, we shift into a phase where we go, I have all these relationships. They do have expectations of me. There's implications if I don't meet the expectation, but I also have my own identity and my own beliefs and my own expectations. And there's that little divorcing that happens that to me is not a small increase in freedom psychologically, right? And we see it in teams all the time, like people wanting to satisfy the boss.
Mhm.
And that itself is preventing that person from performing at their highest potential, potentially. That was quite a long answer, but hopefully that gives some context as to what I mean.
Yes, 100%. And I'm wondering because I feel like we cannot exist without relationships, right?
Mm,
So somehow it feels like more natural to say I am my relationships. You
mm,
know what I mean? Like because I'm part of the bigger. I'm part and everything is interconnected, right?
mm,
But like to give it like somehow it also feels like if you say I have relationships, you put more agency and accountability like back to yourself,
mm,
right? Is like if we talk about boundaries, for example, I had a beautiful conversation with our common friend Lissy about that the other week. And we talked about boundaries and how hard it is for people to set healthy boundaries. And that
mm,
it's like really about like finding the sweet spot. And we're not talking just about organizations. I mean, we're talking in like, family, friends, community, like even with neighbors, we've had this situation a couple of times over here. But
I hope that. I wonder if they listen to the podcast.
yeah, not sure yet, maybe. But it's super interesting because I think the one comes with the other. So we live in this interconnected world. So we have relationships and we need boundaries. And we also have obviously like for me, like one of the most passionate topics on my mind is the role of the individual and how and in the collective. So how
Mm,
can
mm,
we make sure we meet individual needs, but at the same time we're contributing to the collective, right?
mm.
So how do you see that?
Well, yeah, so I think that I totally agree. Our ability to set boundaries, or let's say like the skill or the complexity with which we're able to navigate boundaries, is very much related to this developmental stage. Because if I am my relationships, setting boundaries is very difficult because I'm probably going to hurt someone. And if I hurt them, because I am my relationship, I'm in danger. They might not like me. And that can feel almost like an existential threat to somebody at this stage of development. It's like I've
Exactly.
upset my family, I've upset the social norm, I've upset my boss, they don't like me anymore. These are the kind of things that subconsciously are happening when we set boundaries from that stage. And what that is, it's an overly codependent stage of development. Often when we grow, we swing between being overly individualistic to overly collectivist, right? That's a very common swing. So what can happen is you can go from
Yeah.
overly being, I am what others think of me, to being, no, no, I do whatever I want. And then you set boundaries in this unskillful, almost aggressive way. It's kind of a
Yes.
swing from passive to aggressive. And of course, what we want over time is to understand that you have some needs and I have some needs and I'm responsible for my needs. So I'm going to get them met. I would love to do it in collaboration with you. I would love to do it whilst also supporting you in meeting your own needs,
Mhm.
or seeing if we can help each other out here. But ultimately, I'm responsible for my needs, and that you could argue, you've swung from codependence to independence to hopefully a healthy integration, which you could call interdependence. And that's a really difficult skill to do. It's particularly difficult when really what's going on deep down is, am I under threat? Because if I'm enmeshed with others and I disappoint them, it's me that's at stake here, right?
Uh-huh.
Whereas it feels very different when I realize that I am not you. We're relating right now, but I'm not you. And you being upset with me, I'm not saying I wouldn't feel anything. You don't suddenly become a psychopath, but I'm not your emotions. I'm not responsible for your emotions. It's okay for you to be upset, and that's not a responsibility I have to take on. And then boundaries start to become either easier to set or at least an ability to do so more skillfully. But it's certainly, yeah, it's a journey for us all and a
Mm.
practice.
And there is like also one like vital component in that, which is fear, right? I
Mm,
mean, like obviously we are in the context of what we call love, not fear, and making decisions out of love and not out of fear. But what we've been seeing in organizations is a lot of fear-driven decision making.
mm,
And a part of that is also not setting boundaries because I could lose my job or because I could not get promoted or I could upset my manager or my colleague. And I just want to, kind of like do my job and then I go home and I'm fine. So, how do you think, like, do you have like any suggestions or like a case or like an example of how to nurture a culture where people would decisions more out of love
mm.
rather than out of fear, where healthy boundary setting is, for example, and yeah, just a thriving culture.
I mean, I love this aphorism, by the way, love not fear. I think it captures
Mm.
all sorts of things that can happen psychologically. In this case, I feel like it's an extrinsic intrinsic
Mm.
dichotomy or something. Typically, fear decisions are extrinsic, in my view. Like
Mhm.
sometimes when I think, one of my fears in life, financial, I have financial fears. They're definitely extrinsic to me. Whereas when I'm at my true motivations, when I'm feeling in flow, are intrinsic. They come from me
Mm.
for sure. And it's a difference in our culture, big C culture, between developmentalism, which is what I'm talking about here, which is the inside out growth of a human being. The fact that we know that a baby is going to become a teenager and we know that they'll see the world pretty differently by the fact that by the time they're a teenager than when they're a baby for
Ah,
most people.
yeah.
And then in adulthood, that can continue, although it tends not to happen in adulthood. Behaviorism is the opposite. It comes from like the Skinner boxes, where you would put a rat in a cage and you motivate them through bits of cocaine or reward or food or whatever it might be. And in organizations and schools, we do the same thing. So, actually, do you know what? At my son's school, he now goes to school. We might get into that story a bit
Mhm.
later on. He didn't always. He now goes to school and he chose to go. But what's mad is they get rewards. So they're called points, ISAM points, I think. They get points for good behavior and they get points taken away for bad behavior. And they can get food at the canteen with those points, which I just find like it breaks my heart. But then
Oh
as
my gosh, I
adults,
can just like see this conflict inside of you,
of
like I
course, I
feel
hate it.
very sorry, of course.
And I'm trying to
Knowing
explain
you a
to
little bit, it's like, oh my gosh, you're like exploding from the inside out. I can just see it. Yeah. Okay.
absolutely, it's like, and that is pure fear driven. It's even the getting the points. It's not love driven. It's almost like a fear of not getting the thing, right? It's totally an
Mm.
extrinsic motivation. And we have it in organizations all the time.
Mhm.
You have your review. And when you go to your review at the end of the year or every 6 months, there's a feeling of I have to present myself to the boss, right? So now I'm open for criticism from the outside world again. And if we can just shift that from being an inside out process. My argument is that it's slower at first, but a lot faster in the long term to have people who are operating from that standpoint. It's amazing. And there are practical things that we do in organizations very regularly. One is, whilst we do feedback, we do a lot of self-reflection in groups. So
Mhm.
this is when people really, they have a whole process they go through where they reflect on their own performance, on their own beliefs and values and strengths and weaknesses, and then they get a bit of coaching from others but no opinions, actually, quite importantly, so that they're basically they're doing their own performance review, but really from their own perspective. And we try and give them as little help as possible. Like we give them support, but not more external opinions. We want the inner voice to crank up, because over time, what's amazing is if you have a team where everyone is self-evaluating and self kind of generating their own growth. Another thing we often do is put in a lot of voluntary mechanisms in organizations so that you can volunteer to projects or roles or responsibilities to make your own decisions rather than being like voluntold into
Mhm.
positions. And that's a different mechanism as well. That's not come from the inside, that's come from the outside. So I think as much as possible, if we can shift those kind of various mechanisms we have in organizations to being intrinsic rather than extrinsic, it's
Mhm.
valuable from a performance perspective, but from a human growth perspective as well. And of course, the two are interlinked.
I'm very interested in that feedback process because if we talk feedback, I feel like it's a very extrinsic process because you're getting all these reflections or, like feedback from, like the people, the social system you're part of, whereas it's not necessarily reflecting your internal world because feedback oftentimes is actually more reflecting the purpose, the person's state of being that is giving you feedback, right? Why I'm saying that also is we have experimented with a lot of different kind of feedback processes, and at some point it felt like, I mean, you have to check in with yourself, like, does it really resonate with me, right? Does it really resonate? Like, what is this person saying now? Does that make sense? And there was definitely also feedback in there. I could definitely see the mirror of that person in it, where that like, okay, these are the points that person is very busy with at this point and probably very unconsciously. And it feels like it's projected on me. So I could not really accept the feedback. Whereas others were like, it was so to the point that it felt like so emotional and painful that I was just like sobbing, you know but it was a very intense process, and I felt then, because we did like 360 degrees, and you had like at some point I felt like it was also crossing a line because we also included like the parts of, okay, give me feedback on my individual purpose, how is that aligned to the organization, my values, all these kind of like things that are very, very personal.
Mm,
So it's really hard. Like it's not a performance measure, right? But we had the belief like, okay, you're putting your purpose in that. That's why you're really thriving in your role, right?
mm,
Because it breathes life in your role. So
mm.
there's truth in it, of course, but you can actually only, you should not judge. You should not. So I find it a little like, can you ever not judge? I think that's what I want to say. Like,
I can't.
see? So how do you facilitate these kind
Yeah.
of feedback
Yeah,
loops,
and I don't want to claim to have the kind of secret sauce. I find this quite difficult. So I will tend to, when we work with teams, we'll tend to put two things in place. One's feedback, but the other one is self-reflection, which is what I just mentioned a
Mhm.
moment ago. I, from a purist perspective, value self-reflection far more than I value
Mm.
feedback. That said, I see downsides to it, which is that in an unself-aware person, we're all unself-aware to a degree. I can only be self-aware of what I'm self-aware of. So I'm not self-aware
Exactly.
of all the stuff I'm not self-aware of.
Ex
And I find self-reflection to generate self-awareness, and
Mhm.
particularly around coaching. So when you're asked questions back, that can help to prompt self-awareness. That said, in most organizations, it
Mhm.
doesn't feel enough to the people who are in the existing paradigm that we would just use that. And therefore, there's some desire for some external performance management type thing. So my shift is from a hierarchical feedback method or an anonymous one. So typically it either comes from above or it's
Okay.
anonymous in 360s, to it being peer to peer and open,
Mhm.
which I do believe to be progress. That said, I'm totally with you here. The way in which we give feedback is super dependent on our stage of development. So if I'm in this stage of development where I am my relationships, well, if you give me feedback, that is me. I can take what you're saying as totally true, or I can be so self-defensive that I
Mhm.
can't even
Mhm.
listen to the thing you're saying. You actually have it where people, it feels like you can see in their eyes, they briefly disappear whilst the other person gives feedback. So we do it live a lot of the time. And that is
Mhm.
problematic. I don't quite
Yeah.
know how to get through that. What I have seen is in many individuals that they get feedback and there's that little distancing where they're able to say, this is data, this isn't true. It says as much about them as it does about me. And now it's the opportunity for us to talk about it, right? And
Mhm.
I think actually it's part two that's more interesting. It's not the feedback. It's the, I felt like this when I heard your feedback. Or it's me saying, when I gave you that feedback, I noticed that that says a lot about how these other things that are happening in my
Mm.
own life. And this can be a great vehicle for self-awareness. However, I've not found a way to really land that time after time. Right. So what I've chosen to do is to really mix feedback. So you have feedback and then self-reflection, where
Mhm.
we have a journaling process, typically with a bit of peer coaching, where we try and make sense of it ourselves. But yeah, certainly, feedback comes from engineering. Like there's an input, and the system gives it's highly
Exactly.
mechanistic. It's not actually a
Yes.
human process.
It's not really built for the complexity we are dealing with,
No,
right?
I
With
agree.
the inner and outer worlds. But it's such a vital process because I mean, like, what's behind it is obviously like, how are we functioning as a team? Like, there are always interpersonal tensions as well.
Mm.
And people are oftentimes, we're not equipped for really addressing it because I think most of the time we're also really not equipped for handling conflict well. So we want to rather avoid it and just like want to ride like the harmony waves. And I'm very
Ride the
guilty of that
harmony
too.
waves. I love that.
um, so it's like, but the thing is with friction, obviously, like there comes growth, right? And I was in conversation with a friend like Lais Glück. She is an experienced
Mm.
designer and she is on purpose designing friction into the process, into the organization, into even UX design, like because what you create with friction is not just growth, but you create agency and accountability.
Mhm.
And I love that because when I think about parenting, for example, I really want my Lou to have like I don't know, like a super frictionless life. I really try to make it super comfortable for her. And then I think like, why am I doing this actually? I'm taking all the growth opportunities away from her, right? So it's like it's very interesting because it sounds or feels a little bit paradox. But actually it's not.
No, and we know that teams that have conflict and successfully navigate conflict are far higher performing. And we also know that teams that are the most high performing have the most conflict, but that
Huh.
conflict is not existential. So you have this if you've been in a new relationship and you have an argument, you feel like, oh yeah, we're probably going to break up now, right? Whereas after 10 years, you have an argument and you feel almost closer for it. Like you understand each other better, but it certainly doesn't feel like it's a threat to the relationship. It doesn't feel like it's all ending now. It feels like, okay, this is another thing that we're going to sort out. And you see that in
Well,
high
I
performing
had
teams.
my moments this year that I thought, okay, after 14 years, you know what? Please, there's the door.
Of course, we all have those moments. We all have those moments. But our ability to repair rifts, or if we manage to repair rifts, the amount of cohesion it can create is amazing. And we definitely see that in teams. What we also see, sadly, most of the time is teams that get near conflict and then they come back from it. And as a
Yeah.
result, you're probably not going to reach high performance unless you do that. And that's why where I think feedback does well, even though it's very imperfect in all the ways we just said, is if you have regular feedback sessions as a team, you're kind of forcing an uncomfortable conversation regularly with people that is going to, over time, if you do it as a practice, like we do it quarterly typically with teams, build trust.
Hmm.
And that will lead you to a great place. You have to break through some kind of wall to
Mm.
get to a moment where it feels like this is actually starting to have some flow to it, right?
And it's also interesting, like thinking about this kind of narrative that we should never fight in front of the kids and such, right? Is
Yeah, I
like,
totally disagree.
yeah, exactly. Me too. But this is what has been like, we were told that for, I don't know, decades, right?
Mm,
But the most important part is that, no, they can see that, they should see that, but how do we repair?
that's it.
And if we fail at the repairing part, then we have failed, you know?
Yeah, that you want them to see you repair.
Exactly, exactly. And I've been part of organizations where either conflict was completely avoided. So the internal kind of conflict starts to fire up. People start to burn out. People start to not setting boundaries. People start to get silent, right? Or you have the quiet quitting and stuff. Or the other part is people would speak up because I'm a person. I speak up when things are against my own values. Then I have to speak up to protect my own integrity to a
Mm,
certain extent as well, right? And it happened like one of my like recent organizations I was part of, and it was such an invitation to create change, to
mm,
spark change. And and nothing really happened, right? So, and that was so interesting to me because I was like, yeah, we can be in conflict, but I just gave an invitation also for change and repair, and like nothing is happening.
Mm.
And I'm not, like at some point you just leave because you have been disengaged anyways, right? But I was like thinking, how can people not see that? And then I think, okay, wait a minute, because we've been told for decades that
Mm.
either we're going to ignore it, we walk away, or we just, I don't know, get silent about it and just pretend nothing happened. I would really like to emphasize this. So how do you do that in organizations? Like how do you help people to make up?
Well, yeah, I mean, God, if only like I had the tool to do that for the world right now.
Yeah,
The,
yeah, no kidding.
yeah, there's a few things that are helpful. One, I think, is the role of a leader. So typically, most organizations are hierarchies. Most of them are actually hierarchical hierarchies. So there's hierarchies that don't feel too hierarchical, but there's hierarchies that
Mhm.
really feel hierarchical. And because we're in that paradigm, the role of the people further up that hierarchy has a disproportionate effect on the system. I have had the odd experience where, from some coaching, a CEO has had an argument with a colleague, resolved it, and then said to the group, either digitally or in a meeting, me and in this person, we've been in a lot of conflict recently and we've managed to understand each other and now we want to do this. And
Yeah.
I think that sends a message.
Mhm.
It's like such a small thing that can have like it's a great lever. It has a disproportionate effect. So that's
Yeah.
one. I think some mediation is also really valuable, whether it's mediation or just good facilitation. So at a slightly lower level, perhaps. I think that's really important. What I would really counsel leaders to not do is play the messenger between people.
Mhm.
It's very common that you would come at me annoyed about person X, and then person X comes at me annoyed about you,
Exactly.
and I'm just talking to you both individually. At that moment, I need to get you both together and we need to create some honesty and create some understanding and listening to one another. Having that as a practice is so beneficial. Of course, there's reasons why we don't do it. It's definitely friction. But first of all, it actually takes less time than all the back and forth. It creates less gossip and all
Mm.
that stuff. It helps both people to grow. It helps their relationship to grow. It's just a really great thing to be doing. And sadly, yeah, we shy away from that far too often. Weirdly, I'm like a mosquito to a light with this stuff. Like I just want to go and clean it up. Or not clean it up, but I want us to meet because I
Yes.
feel like there's an
Yeah.
intimacy actually in that.
Yeah.
And I almost feel like it feels dirty when that's not happening, kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. And also, I mean, like, just imagine if like the manager is intervening, right? You are definitely taking agency and accountability
Totally.
away from these people. So you treat them as kids in a way, right? I mean,
If you reinforce a parent-child dynamic fundamentally.
100%. Yeah. Which you are not the greatest fan of. But let's talk about that for a second. Unschooling. Tell us a little bit more about that, please.
Yeah, so my journey into parenthood has been different, sadly and beautifully in many ways. But what it meant was that when I met my wife and my now son, he was just 6, and we decided to go traveling very quickly. And when we went traveling, we went to live in this eco village and with an amazing, very alternative school in the jungle in Costa Rica for 6 months.
Mhm.
And I learned so much from this school. It was phenomenal. And really, I learned about these developmental stages and how kids just see the world differently at different stages. But the whole ethos of the school is around autonomy. And in fact, I was going to say it there. They would say, don't steal their autonomy.
Wow.
So, for example, they would say, gave us some great advice, went to a few kind of workshops as parents, and they'd give us really cool bits of advice, like in the kitchen, make sure all the things they need are on the bottom shelf so that they are, and make sure there's a stool so that they can go up to the tap because you want your child getting their own water as early as possible. You
Mm.
don't want them on the sofa saying, "Mum, I want water," and then they get water. You want them to say, "Mum, I want water," and you say, "Oh, that's cool." Awkward silence. "Can you get me some? I'll help you." And then
I
you know
need to
how
do
to
that
do
with
it.
my Lou too. Okay. Yes.
And it's hard, but there's all these small moments.
Yeah.
Ours with my boy was around breakfast, and I gotta say, in hindsight, I was too harsh too early. So there's a archetypically a masculine and feminine archetype here that are potentially you can go too far either way. But I talk a lot about how he'd say, "Well, what can I have for breakfast?" "I don't know. What do you want to have for breakfast?" And I could just say like eggs on toast, mate. But no, I
Yeah.
don't know. What do you want? What's healthy? What's so I'm trying to get him to make his own decisions.
Mhm.
And I must say, like pretty young, I come down in the morning and he's frying himself some eggs or whatever. He still struggles with those decisions, like we all do. To be honest, I don't know what to
Mhm.
wear when there's a party. Like that. It's not like this ever leaves in your life. But they were really hell bent on helping someone nurture their autonomy to the level that's appropriate for their age. Right, like
Mhm.
that's really really important. And so after that philosophy really stayed with us, and we saw him grow just like tremendously as a person,
Mhm.
socially, emotionally, and actually cognitively. So then
Mhm.
we thought we can't go back to school. Like this feels so out of order. It feels
Right.
mean actually. So we carried on what's called unschooling. We were in Portugal with some friends for a while, and then now in the UK. It turns out there's loads of kids doing this.
Mhm.
One of the myths is that if you're unschooling, you're alone. But actually, there's loads of other kids doing it. And what it
Understood.
simply means is that you are trying to make the child's inner curriculum take over, right? You're trying to nurture their own ability to know themselves, and that means a lot of finding great activities for them to do, and a lot of driving and taking them there, and a lot of social groups, a lot of play, really play orientated, and just to give listeners a sense of our story when he was 12 and a half, I think, he kind of called a bit of a family meeting. So we were running our family very, very democratically. And he said, I want to go to school, like traditional school,
Mhm.
which was so weird for me because on one part I was heartbroken. And the other part
Right.
of me was, I cried because I was honestly so proud because he said, I want to go and get a great education and I want to try something. And I couldn't believe that this was coming from him. And actually, a couple of months after he did go to school, and he's now doing what's amazing is he had no adaptation period. He just did really, really well. And
Really?
his teachers
Wow.
actually said, "My God, this doesn't reflect well on primary school that he didn't go, and yet he's he's doing really well in all of
Yeah.
his subjects." He said to us, "Thank you that I got to choose to go because I can tell not everyone
Nice.
chose to go." And that is the difference for me
Yeah.
in the autonomy piece and the
Yes.
effect that that has.
That makes a lot of sense. This is so exciting, and also like a lot of questions are coming up. Like, how could you facilitate that? Because you were at home, right? Like, so one of you had to stay home then as well and facilitate all that, like just like logistical stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not like that the system is really supporting that.
No, it's a change in lifestyle, and it was very difficult.
Hmm.
There were points at most. I'd say at first maybe I did a little bit more, and then it was really 50-50. But then by the end, I was probably doing 25%, and Gab's probably doing 75% or something like that. So it varied. Towards the end, she got very tired. It was like, "Listen, I'm ready to stop. I'm ready to stop this." Because it is a decision that your family is going to run differently. So you can't both work
Yes.
full time, for example. So
Yeah.
we had a lot of lost income. So financially it was hard at time. It's like it's not expensive. It's not like an actual cost, but the cost is that you're just earning quite a bit
Mhm.
less. So that was very hard. And of course, you have to be around. It means our family had to have a culture. We couldn't have babysitters all day long and then be a family in the evening after work. We had to
Right.
learn to negotiate our diaries together and our needs and activities. And I absolutely love it and couldn't do it my whole life. I put my hats on. I know, we've got some friends who have, I believe, 7 kids and they've done the whole thing
Wow.
to the end, and it's phenomenal. I've never met such a creative, loving family in my life. Like it really, it's like the film Captain Fantastic, which I recommend people watch. It's just phenomenal. So we did, we went pretty far, but didn't quite go all the way with that. Yeah, but it is difficult logistically. You're absolutely right. And not everyone can do it. I would like to
Yeah, yeah,
add there's
exactly.
a
Because also a different kind of mindset comes with it. Like a friend of mine, they did it with like they also had like both of their children
mm,
at home homeschooled.
mhm,
And he just always said, well, it's like, we're one social system as a family, right? So it doesn't matter where the money is coming in. It doesn't matter who is having which role unless, like it fits to the person and the person wants to do it. So they also had like their days that they did work, and then how they were like, teaching the kids and to what kind of activities they would bring them. And I have
mm,
so much respect for that,
mm.
because I can just like, I don't know, I think I wouldn't know where to start, or I would overdo it, or I would, like I'm like
Oh, yeah, and we did
a
all those
very
things, right?
extreme person, you know?
Yeah, and the same. Like those phases where I wanted to teach, and we were like, "That's not working." But then
Mm.
also, really, like, still is parenting. This is the case for everybody, I'm sure, but it's very confronting. Like, I
Mhm.
realized I wanted to give him all. I want to give him all this autonomy. So, I mean, the joke in my family, it's a joke, no joke, is that I am authoritarian about democracy. Like, it absolutely must be democratic. Like, at one point, we had our kind of family charter on the wall, and we made decisions together. So, for example, we negotiated his screen time with him.
Mhm.
And when he was very little, he kind of hardly got anything, but we wanted to make sure that he felt a role in that. And then one day he said, I'd like to add a new rule to the charter, and that's that when we're in the kitchen together, you two aren't allowed your phones. If you have to leave the
Oh.
room if you want to go and make a call or something, but you don't do it in the room. And I just remember going, shit, I hate this democracy. And of course he was totally correct, right?
Yes.
And so we tried all these things, but they also feel, it's far too intense. It's sort of like, I'm happy
Yeah.
we played, but I think our family now probably resembles much of a normal family. Although I think we have just benefited enormously for the journey that we've been on,
Mm.
trying to do something a bit different. Yeah.
And it also depends what you're considering normal, right? Because what's I don't know, like we have all different kind of perspectives on normal, I would say. But what was why did he make that decision to go to like governmental school?
I mean, it's difficult without, he's all people are different.
Mhm.
That's one thing, and that felt right to him. He likes structure a lot, and he really wanted someone to give him a structure. And it's a really interesting one because I was thinking, well, maybe that's the reason for him to not have a structure so that he can learn to
Mhm.
create his own structure. Equally, he just really does like having a structure. So I don't quite know. We're all different. Um, his reasoning at the time was about he just really felt like I want to be out with a far broader section of people.
Mhm.
Is he probably the thing with unschooling? So the kind of myth, not myth. I've heard this expression. You won't believe this, but people say, "Don't children need to be socialized?" That's the rule I've heard, as if as if naturally they're not social, but you have to make them social. Whilst I find that crazy, I also understand what someone's saying. They're saying, okay, so
Yeah.
it's just them at home with their parents, and it's like, no,
Yes.
it's not like that. So that there's truth in it, but not truth in it. So what it actually looks like is that they have a small friendship group. I'd say they have an extended friendship, probably had an extended friendship group of 20 people
Mhm.
and a very strong friendship group of 5 to 10. However, he spends 75% of his time playing with all those people.
Mhm.
Whereas in a school, you might have a social group, an extended social group of 100 and a close social group of 30. However, you're not allowed to speak for 6 hours of the day. So it's not a very
Yes.
social environment to have a social group in. So it's kind of a quality over quantity
Mhm.
type situation with a lot of unschooling, I think. I would add unschooling by its very nature looks totally different in two different families.
Mhm.
For us, that's what it looked like. And what he wanted was to feel, and I think it was what I loved, what really like genuinely brought me to tears was that it was an empowering, like, I want to go out and be a part of all the things, right? And it's
Mhm.
come from him. And actually, what was mad is at the school in Costa Rica, they had said to us, so I brought this up. I was like, what about friendships and stuff? And they'd said, he's just going to want you for a few years and it's what would happen. It's what nature wants. But there's going to be an age where he's going to ask for himself to go out into the world. And it happened like clockwork because they said it will happen around 11 to 13 and it happened at 12. And it was like, wow. So it just felt like that's what the organism wanted to do for its next stage of development. Right.
And respecting it, right? And the needs, because that's also
Mm,
like one of the things that we're so good as a system and society, I think, in overriding children's needs. And
hmm
with that, also in overriding like our own needs and, like everybody's needs in a way. And that's why, a lot of stuff is happening. A lot of, like these inner conflicts happening and
mm.
people losing themselves, not knowing what they really want from life, not knowing who they are and what they're good at and what they want to bring into the world, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
You go and get your first jobs and you have no clue what you want to do because you don't know who you are, and you don't know who you are because you've been doing someone else's curriculum, not your own curriculum.
exactly.
And it's why for me it was so interesting because obviously I didn't really want him to go to school,
Mhm.
but I wanted him to choose, and he chose to go to school. And so
Mhm.
I felt so proud that he chose. right?
Yes.
And so there was that conflict in me is a paradox.
Yes.
But ultimately, given the two, my slightly purist view of how life can be and my value around, well, my value or my love around autonomy, I
Hmm.
choose that every time. And so I'm so happy that he chose, right?
Yes.
And I do think it's night and days in the same situation as everyone else, but he chose to be there.
Yeah.
And it's also made homework easier because if he doesn't want to do it, I go, oh, that's okay. Do you think we should stop school? And then he goes, no, 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 no. I'm going to school and I'm going to do my homework, right? So he knows that he's chosen the downside, but he's
Yeah.
chosen it, and it does
Hmm.
seem to make some difference. You know, I think he does pretty well at getting all that done, and I think it plays. I'd like to think it plays a role that he has chosen what comes with it.
It's super interesting because like, choice is if we talk about like organizational
Mm,
transformation, right? Or it's just it's not the choice of everybody, right? And I'm not sure if you are if you know like the concept of the adaptive org, but it's all around doing things by invitation. So
mhm, mhm.
you are firing up like these processes by invitation. You have a problem and you are inviting all the stakeholders of the problem to solve the problem. And this is actually how the transformation is taking place. And I feel like that's very rooted into the things that you have been describing in this microsystem, right? That you are part of with your family. But I think that's like what we're also overriding a lot of times, right? It's like not really how transformation or change happens in organizations, probably like 85% of the time, right?
Yeah, or more. Yeah, I totally agree. For me, that value is not only like I care about it. I've just
Hmm.
seen it to be more effective. Like if people, you know, there's a couple of expressions that spring to mind. One was Peter Senge's quote: "People don't mind change; they mind being changed."
Hmm.
You
Hmm.
know, and then the other one is systems only accept their own solutions.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Or in behavioral science, you have the IKEA effect, which is where they study two groups of people. They give them both IKEA furniture. One of them has to build their own, but one of them has it pre-built. And then they ask them to pay for it. And the group that builds their own pays more. I believe it's like 25% more. And it's because they love the thing that they built, not the thing that was made
Mm.
for them, because they're invested, they have a sense of ownership, right? And so again, I think it's slower, but those
Mhm.
invites, you know, I've had a couple of experiences. I would say these are edge cases, but it was quite remarkable where we did exactly what you just said. So we invited people to a question, they unpick it, they self-identify what needs to change, they get into groups, they form projects, and then I've come 6 months later, and they're all still happening, and they've all led to stuff, but there was no obligation for them to do anything. They really are acting like volunteers. And that's
Mm.
because it's come from them. I'm convinced that it was because it was intrinsic.
There is like one more thing I would love to talk to you about is consciousness. In the space of progressive work and new work and all the titles we can use for what we have been describing here or you have been describing here as well, right? With like building organizations a little bit more decentralized with more autonomy and agency, oftentimes the topic of consciousness comes up. Oh, we just have to create like more conscious organizations. We have to like, go in there and make people more conscious. And there's different kind of models out there that are supporting that. And I mean, one very popular one, I think a lot of people know the book of Reinventing Organizations by Frederic Laloux is the integral theory by Ken Wilber or spiral dynamics, right? And we talked a little bit about that before, like how is that even relevant and how is that inclusive and how does it really make a company's benefit from it in a way,
Mm.
right?
You're bringing this conversation up at the end of our chat. It's a
I'm
big one, isn't it? But no, that's fine. That's fine.
We can always set up another
Maybe
session.
there's a good part too, but I will honor the question. First of all, the word consciousness in this context is the one that I agree with you. It's the one I hear a lot, and it's misused as far as I can tell. Because in
Mm,
science, consciousness is simply that there's anything that it's like to be that organism. So a bat has consciousness. My dog seems to have consciousness. It's just
mhm.
their consciousness is very different. I'm pretty sure he dreams in smells, for example, and I don't dream in smells. Right. So
Yeah.
so consciousness is actually like it's such a packed word that typically has spiritual connotations, and I think it's being used in entirely the wrong context here. What those models tend to look at, so the Laloux book, which I absolutely love, It's based on spiral dynamics, which is by Graves, but adopted famous by Wilbur. I would call those levels of development. And I think this is a super tricky conversation to get into simply because I think there is huge amounts of truth to this. So what I was describing earlier when I described the socialized minds and the self-authoring minds, those are also stages of development. That said, acknowledging them creates awful hierarchies that are not useful. They recompound the same problems. That's very clear. They're also not that easy to act on. Me knowing my level of development or knowing yours, if in fact that research is as robust as we want to think it is, I don't know that it helps us. I don't know what to
Mhm.
do with that. I don't think it's potentially that useful. And so, yeah, I feel like there's an inconvenient truth potentially
Mhm.
here. I do find it useful, for example, in hiring people at strategic levels, just like IQ might be an interesting thing to know um, in some contexts and not others. Someone's level of development might also be useful to know for particularly more strategic work that one's doing because it requires the ability to integrate more paradox and variables than like a job or I don't know, that's more manual, for example. So these things feel true and useful and yet utterly unapplicable and potentially very divisive. And
Mhm.
so to build whole theories around them is slightly bothersome and difficult. And yet, like I got to say, when I'm working with a team, you spot the patterns, and that I guess to a degree is helpful.
Yeah.
Like for example, it's very clear that some teams get stuck in overly consensus-driven patterns. But I think
Mhm.
what we can probably do is name the patterns and help a group or an individual to become self-aware of one's patterns,
Mhm.
and potentially we don't need levels or stages, but knowing patterns is useful. So knowing that I'm seeing the world as I am my relationships rather than I have them, maybe I can help somebody to claim some awareness of that by just bringing it up regularly. But I don't need to know that that's stage three. If you get it, it's
Yeah.
not a computer game. So I think it's a very divisive, complex topic that I find fascinating and
Mhm.
true and yet not useful is
Mhm.
my long, slightly cautious answer about it, Tina. I don't know. How does
I
that
completely
resonate?
resonate. No, I completely resonate with that because there's like already so much complexity to unpack in that model itself. And
Yeah.
then there's a lot of questionable things in there indeed. As soon as you start clustering people into levels or stages,
Mm,
there is already a hierarchy in place. There is already some kind of inequality in place. And what I think in general, what is true for models or I don't know, like perspectives like that is it can always be like a conversation starter for like a collective exploration. And I
absolutely.
think if we would look at models more like that, I think it would be very healthy because oftentimes, and I feel this in our space to be very true, that there's a lot of idealism in it, but there's also a lot of this framework and model adaptation in there, and that kind of like it just not always really makes sense. It's like because the needs of the individual as well as of the collective or the social system are simply not met, but
Hmm.
it's like because somebody else said like this is the blueprint we're going to be following and we're going to go to XY result, we're going to be good. So it's like I think we need to like change our perspective around that a little bit more to get more agency and accountability back, right? To look at it like more like, okay, what is really coming out of that space that we have been nurturing, right? And looking out of that with this tool at the situation XY as an exploration. I think so. I resonate 150%.
And all those models, there's various ones because they're supposed to measure different lines of development. They all have some patterns in common, which I think
Hmm.
are interesting. So one is that typically people swing from individualism to collectivism. That's an interesting thing to notice in oneself, right? Is my thinking right now overly this way or overly that way? That's
Hmm.
just useful because I can rebalance.
Very much.
One is they have subject object shift. So I am my relationships. I'm the subject of them. I have my relationships. They're now the object. Noticing that essentially the nurturing of self awareness. That's super useful. So if you just talked about that, I think you've actually got most of the value from the model with almost none of the division that is created by the model.
Perfect. Yes. Thank you so much for that. I think that's a wonderful closure, actually. Um, well, it was such a pleasure having you here, John. Really, a lot of insights. I made like a lot of notes as well. So I hope our audience did too. And yeah, thank you so much for your presence, for your wisdom, and we'll talk soon.
You too. Thanks for a great chat. Cheers, Tina. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.